Tortured and beaten, a jury says a McLean County woman is guilty of kicking her boyfriend's daughter to death. We do want to warn you, you may find some of the video in this case disturbing. Minash Kungwari reports.
Evidence presented showed Cynthia Baker regularly beat 8-year-old Rica Rountree before her death, abuse that took place at the home that Baker and Rica's father both shared. Video of that abuse, along with other evidence, was enough to convince a 12-person jury beyond a reasonable doubt.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Cynthia Baker, guilty of the offense of first-degree murder. It is signed by the 4-person and other 11 jurors.
Cynthia now awaits a February court date where she will learn her punishment. She faces a sentence of up to 200 years.
Altogether, and the bottom line is this is child abuse. This is repetitive injury to a child over numerous, I would say, weeks.
Doctors say Rica died from a kick to the stomach. Testimony and video evidence suggests Cynthia did not do this alone. Detectives presented text messages between Baker and Rica's father.
Would life be better without Rica? Defendant. I don't know. I don't want to say yes. That is your daughter.
The day Richard Rountree was supposed to testify, he handed a letter to the Normal Police Department in which Baker asked him to take the blame for everything.
Cynthia Baker, found guilty of murdering 8-year-old Rica Rountree, was set to be sentenced in about a month. Baker is now requesting a new trial, and Rica's mother, Antoinetta, believes there's no reason to keep dragging out the inevitable.
She's guilty. She needs to just accept her guilt and just go to prison and start her time.
Antoinetta Rountree believes there are many more people that need to be held accountable.
I'm seeking full justice. Everybody that got up on the stand, because I wasn't there, but everybody that got on the stand and said they saw something is responsible for my daughter's death.
Rountree says she's now trusting the system she claims failed her family before, not to fail them again. She hopes the situation prevents other families from experiencing a similar situation.
I want to make sure parents don't have to go through what I went through. I want to make sure that my son don't have to continue to go through what he going through. He should be home with me. We should be able to grieve and mourn together.
Rountree saw Baker for the first time since her daughter's death on Friday. She says no matter what, she is going to pursue justice for everyone responsible for the death of Rica. She hopes this will create change within the Child Services Department in McLean County.
This is the story of Rica Rountree, an innocent 8-year-old girl who never got the chance to grow up. A child whose laughter should have filled the air, whose biggest worries should have been spelling tests and playground games, but instead, she spent her final days enduring unthinkable cruelty at the hands of the very people who should have protected her. This tragedy took place in Normal, Illinois, a town where people go about their daily lives never suspecting that behind closed doors, an unspeakable nightmare was unfolding. And by the time anyone realized how severe it was too late. Rica was gone. But the real horror in this story is that this little girl had been crying out for help long before her death. And no one listened. Perhaps people around her ignored her cries because they thought she was kidding. You know, doing child's things. Now let me ask you this. What would you do if you saw a child with bruises on their arms? A little girl who flinches when an adult raises their voice? Would you step in? Would you ask questions? Would you push authorities to investigate further? Or would you assume that someone else will handle it? That it's none of your business? That question is why we are here today. This little girl, who is the center of our story today, needed someone to make it their business. She needed someone to care enough, to push hard enough, and to stop what was happening behind those closed doors. But time and time again, she was failed. Her teachers saw the bruises, her neighbors heard the screams, the Department of Children and Family Services, DCFS, received multiple reports. And yet, she was sent back into a house of horrors, where she would ultimately meet her death. This isn't just another random story of crime. This is a gut-wrenching example of how a system designed to protect children did nothing. A system that had every opportunity to save this little girl, but instead allowed her to be tortured until her body could take no more. And the most annoying and shocking part of this story is that the person responsible for her pain documented the abuse, as if it were some twisted game. Videos were found on a phone. Videos showing Rica being beaten. Videos show her being humiliated, degraded, and treated like she was less than human. And yet, this child still smiled in school. She still tried to be strong. She still clung to the hope that maybe someone would save her. But alas, no one did. Brace yourself, because this story will make you angry. It will make you question how something like this could happen right under people's noses. And by the end of it, you'll be left wondering how many other children are out there right now, suffering in silence, hoping that someone, anyone, will listen before it's too late. So before we dive in, I want to take a moment to say thank you to all my incredible viewers and subscribers. Your likes, your shares, your comments, they don't just help this channel, they keep stories like this alive. They remind the world that we cannot turn away from the truth no matter how difficult it is to hear. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and become part of this community of people who refuse to look away. Because stories like Rica's deserve to be told. Now, let's get into it. I want you to imagine this. A crisp, cold January day in Illinois. A frantic 911 call is made. The voice on the other end is panicked, barely able to explain what's happening. An 8-year-old girl is unresponsive. Her small body lies motionless, her lips pale, her breathing faint. The paramedics rush into the home, and what they see immediately sets off alarm bells. Rica is covered in bruises, some fresh, some faded, evidence of prolonged abuse. They lift her tiny frame onto a stretcher, and as they do, they notice something disturbing. She is painfully thin, malnourished, as if she hadn't been fed properly for months. She is rushed to the hospital. The doctors work tirelessly to stabilize her. But as they examine her frail body, they realize this isn't just a case of neglect. This is something much worse. A large bruise spreads across her stomach, a deep and ugly mark that tells a horrifying story. X-rays and scans reveal the truth. Rica's internal organs have been severely damaged. Her intestine, ruptured, her abdomen was filled with blood. She had been suffering for days, unable to eat, unable to move, and no one took her to a doctor. As the surgeons worked desperately to save her life, Rica's small body simply gives up. She dies on the operating table, 8 years old, dead from repeated blunt force trauma. But the horror doesn't end there. Because when authorities question the people who were supposed to care for her, the people who should have been the first to protect her, what they uncover is something straight out of a nightmare. Rica had been begging for help for years. She told her teachers. She told the adults around her. Reports were made. DCFS was called. And yet, she was sent back into the arms of her abuser time and time again. And that abuser, she goes by the name Cynthia Baker. She's not Rica's biological mother, but her stepmother. A woman with a documented history of cruelty. A woman who had already been investigated for abuse, but had somehow managed to slip through the cracks. And what Cynthia did to Rica, it wasn't just discipline gone too far. It was a cruel, systematic torture. She forced Rica to stand for hours, holding heavy cans, naked and shivering. She kneed her in the back until she collapsed in pain. She dragged her across the floor by her neck like an object, not a child. And the worst part of it all is that she recorded it. She recorded herself beating Rica, humiliating her, threatening her. And why? Because to her, it was entertainment. To her, Rica's suffering was something to laugh at. Even when Rica couldn't take it anymore, when her tiny body was failing from months, years of abuse, Cynthia still didn't stop. She didn't care that Rica was vomiting from the pain. She didn't care that she was too weak to move. She didn't care that her internal organs were shutting down. Instead, when Rica finally lay motionless on that cold floor, barely clinging to life, Cynthia's first concern wasn't to get her help. It wasn't to call 911. It wasn't to save the child she had tortured. Her first concern was the mess. You better clean that up. It's disgusting. That was her reaction to Rica dying. Not fear, not regret, not horror, just annoyance. That tells you everything you need to know about the kind of monster we're dealing with. But here's the real question. Why was Rica still in that house? Why, after multiple reports of abuse? Why, after teachers saw bruises, after neighbors heard the screams? Why was Rica still forced to live with the very people who would end her life? That is the question that will haunt you by the end of this story. Because Rica Rountree could have been saved. She should have been saved. But she wasn't. And that is the real crime here. This is only the beginning. Stay with me, because this story is far from over.
Arguments begin in the case against a normal woman accused of murdering a child. Prosecutors today describing her as emotionless.
Cynthia Baker is accused of killing her boyfriend's daughter, 8-year-old Rica Rountree. Manash Kwangwari was in court today as lawyers gave opening statements. Manash.
Terror, torture, and isolation. Those were the words used by Assistant State's Attorney Mary Cole to describe 8-year-old Rica Rountree's last day alive. Cole says Baker beat her, and later she was pronounced dead at OSF St. Francis Medical Center in Peoria. During her opening statements, Cole described the, quote, hate Baker had for her ex-boyfriend's daughter. In retrieved text messages presented today, Cynthia said, quote, I don't like her at the house. I don't know what to do with her. I really hate your daughter, and if she were my daughter, I'd strangle her. The jury was visibly taken back. And in an effort to give his client a fighting chance, defense lawyer John Riggle told the jury it's not their job to determine if Cynthia could have killed Rica, but rather whether she did it beyond a reasonable doubt.
There's a certain kind of evil that hides in plain sight. The kind that doesn't announce itself with fangs and claws, but instead smiles at the neighbors, drops kids off at school, and blends in with the crowd. The kind of evil that pretends to be a loving caretaker while behind closed doors tortures a child. And for Rica Rountree, that evil had a name, Cynthia Baker. When Rica's biological mother lost custody, Rica was sent to live with her father, Richard Rountree, and his girlfriend, Cynthia. From the outside, it might have seemed like a normal arrangement. A child living with her father, getting a fresh start. But behind the walls of that house, Rica's fresh start quickly turned into a never-ending nightmare. Her smiles faded. Her laughter disappeared. Her childhood was stolen. And no one, not her teachers, not the neighbors, not the authorities, could stop what was happening inside that home. Because no one saw the full truth. But Rica did. She lived it. The abuse started small. At first, it was just little things. Rica was treated differently from the other kids in the house. She was given smaller portions at dinner and forced to eat last, if she was allowed to eat at all. She was locked in her room for hours as punishment. She was forced to sleep on a cold mattress with no blankets while the other children had warm beds. She was denied simple joys, playing outside, watching TV, and even speaking freely. Cynthia wanted control over Rica, and she made sure Rica knew that every single second of the day. But it didn't stop there. Because Cynthia wasn't just cruel. She was sadistic. She didn't just punish Rica, she enjoyed punishing her. She would make Rica stand for hours, arms stretched out, holding heavy cans. If Rica's arms shook or dropped, Cynthia would strike her across the face or grab her by the throat and whisper, "Do I need to put a collar on you?" And this wasn't just once. This wasn't a bad day or a lapse in judgment. This was daily. Rica lived in constant fear, knowing that at any moment she could be hit, insulted, humiliated, or worse. And her father? Richard Rountree stood by and let it happen. But what's worse than a father who ignores the abuse of his own child? A father who participates. Because Richard wasn't just a bystander. He was an accomplice. Inside the walls of that house, Rica was not a daughter. She was a prisoner. While Richard's other children lived normal lives, playing, eating, sleeping in comfortable beds, Rica was treated like she was less than human. She was called a burden. She was told she was worthless. She was beaten over the smallest things. And her father, who was supposed to protect her, rather laughed along with Cynthia. The text messages between them tell the real story. One message from Cynthia to Richard. "I really hate your daughter." Richard's response? Silence. No defense. No outrage, just acceptance. In another message, Cynthia joked about getting rid of Rica. Richard's response? "It is, babe." They talked about Rica like she was disposable. And the kids in the house? They absorbed it. Because abuse like this doesn't happen in isolation. It infects everyone around it. Even Richard's other children joined in on the cruelty. One of them, Cynthia's daughter, kicked Rica in the stomach while Cynthia laughed. Another time, one of the children hit Rica so hard she hit her head against the TV stand. Cynthia's reaction? She laughed. Because in this house, Rica's pain wasn't a tragedy. It was entertainment. The horrifying thing about this case isn't just what happened inside that house, it's that there were so many chances to save Rica, so many red flags, so many opportunities for someone, anyone, to intervene. But every time, the system failed. Teachers noticed bruises on Rica's arms and face. Neighbors heard screams and crying at night. Reports were made to DCFS, again and again, and every time the response was the same. Allegations unfounded. Think about that for a second. Multiple bruises, black eyes, fear in a little girl's eyes every time she was asked about home. And yet, nothing was done. One teacher noticed that Rica was too afraid to speak about her bruises. She wrote in her report, "She seems terrified. She won't talk. Something is very wrong." But instead of forcing an investigation, instead of pushing harder, DCFS closed the case after case. Until one day, Rica stopped coming to school altogether. Until one day, she was gone. The last days of Rica's life were pure suffering. She had been vomiting for days from the injury that would eventually kill her. She was so weak that she could barely walk. Her vision was blurry. She told Cynthia she didn't feel good. Cynthia's response? "You're fine." No hospital visit, no doctor, no care, even though her body was failing. Until finally, her body gave out. Until finally, Rica collapsed. And when she was rushed to the hospital, it was already too late. Her body had been fighting for days, trying to survive, trying to hold on. But there was only so much she could take. She died on the operating table, surrounded by strangers, because the people who were supposed to love her never cared enough to keep her alive. Cynthia Baker is a monster. That much is clear. But she wasn't the only person who failed Rica. Her father failed her. DCFS failed her. Her neighbors, her community, the system itself, they all failed her. And that's why this case is so infuriating. Because it should have never happened. This wasn't a case of one bad night. This was years of abuse, years of a little girl crying for help, years of reports being ignored, years of torture. Until one day, Rica simply couldn't take anymore. And the most painful part? She knew she was going to die. The bruises, the pain, the starvation, it all led to one inevitable conclusion. And Rica knew that no one was coming to save her. She knew the system wasn't going to help. She knew she was alone. And that is the real tragedy. Because Rica deserved to live. She deserved a childhood. She deserved to grow up. And now, she's just another statistic. But we won't let that happen. We won't let her name be forgotten, because her story is not over. The pain had become a constant in Rica Rountree's life. By the time she reached her final days, her body was nothing more than a battlefield, a map of bruises, scars, and brokenness that told the story of what she had endured. She had learned to live in suffering, to expect pain, to know that no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried to obey, it would never be enough. But this time, her body couldn't take it anymore. January 25th, 2019. Rica had been throwing up for days, her stomach twisted in unbearable agony. She could barely stand, her legs weak, her steps wobbly. She had stopped eating. Not because she didn't want to, because she couldn't. Her abdomen was swollen, her insides burning from the infection spreading through her small body. Her intestines had ruptured, leaking toxic fluid inside her. Her body was shutting down. And she knew it. She had cried out in pain, but the only response she got was anger. Cynthia Baker wasn't concerned about Rica's condition. She was annoyed. Rica was an inconvenience, a mess that she didn't want to deal with. And so, instead of rushing her to a hospital, instead of making sure this suffering child got the medical attention she desperately needed, Cynthia decided to teach Rica a lesson. She didn't see a dying child. She saw a burden. So she kicked her. A hard, violent kick to the stomach. The same stomach that was already failing. The same stomach that was already on the verge of collapse. A fatal blow. Rica fell to the floor, gasping. She had no fight left. No screams, no pleas. Just silence. And what did Cynthia Baker do? She walked away, left Rica lying there, broken and helpless. Hours passed. Rica was still on the floor, still dying. She couldn't move. She was too weak to stand, too exhausted to cry. Her breathing became shallow. She was slipping away. It wasn't until the next morning that Cynthia finally called 911. By then, Rica was barely conscious. When paramedics arrived, they immediately knew this was bad. She was cold to the touch. Her lips were pale, her breathing faint. They asked what happened. Cynthia lied. She said Rica had been sick for a few days, that she had just collapsed. But the bruises told the real story, the fresh ones, the old ones, the ones that covered her entire body. The paramedics rushed her to the hospital, working desperately to keep her alive. But Rica was already gone. Her little body had suffered too much. And by the time doctors cut her open to see what had been done to her, it was too late. Her intestines were shredded, her abdomen was filled with blood. Her body was beyond repair. And then came the final words no child should ever have written on their medical file. Cause of death: homicide. At 8 years old, Rica Rountree was officially pronounced dead. After Rica's death, Cynthia Baker did what all cowards do. She lied. She denied everything. She played dumb, acting as if she had no idea how Rica could have suffered such injuries. She said Rica had been clumsy, that she had fallen. But the evidence was undeniable. The bruises, the scars, the videos Cynthia recorded of herself torturing Rica. And then there were the text messages. The ones where Cynthia and Richard joked about getting rid of Rica. The ones where they laughed about how much they hated her. The case against them was rock solid. And when the police uncovered Cynthia's phone, they found something even more disturbing. A letter. A letter she had written to her boyfriend from jail. In it, she begged him to take the blame for what had happened. She wrote, "They're going to give me life for something I didn't do." She wasn't sorry Rica was dead. She was sorry she got caught. And the jury saw right through her. Cynthia Baker was put on trial for first-degree murder, child abuse, and endangerment.
And prosecutors in McLean County are trying to paint Cynthia Baker as a habitual abuser, which led to her striking and killing her then-boyfriend's 8-year-old daughter, Rica Rountree. Manoj Kongwari was in the courtroom for day 3 of the trial against Baker, in which she is accused of killing Rountree. Manoj, what is the defense's claim?
According to autopsy reports, Rica Rountree died in January because her intestines burst and blood seeped into her stomach. A surgeon who took the stand Thursday said a kind of injury like that could have been caused by a car accident, a fall directly on the stomach from 10 feet or higher, or getting punched and kicked in the stomach very hard. The state believes Baker kicked Rica in the stomach, ultimately leading to her death. But others who lived in the house say Baker never touched Rica. A 19-year-old living in the house said she never saw Cynthia physically hit Rica, but she admits there was animosity between the two once Rica moved in, calling it a rocky relationship.
Do you remember telling Detective DeRosa that Rica rebelled against Cindy, telling her that she was not her mom and she couldn't tell her what to do?
I never saw that, I heard it.
Would you agree if a child told a mother or a stepmother that, it might cause it to be rocky there at first? Their relationship?
Yes.
However, Cynthia's 7-year-old daughter also took the stand Thursday, and she said she witnessed Cynthia kick Rica in the stomach twice. She said this happened sometime after Christmas. Rica was pronounced dead in late January. In Bloomington, I'm Manoj Kongwari.
The prosecution presented every horrible detail. The videos of her abuse, the autopsy report detailing the injuries Rica had suffered, the testimonies from teachers who had reported Rica's bruises. The jury sat in horrified silence. It took them less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. Guilty. Cynthia Baker was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But what about Richard Rountree, the father who let this happen? He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. 8 years for letting his daughter be tortured to death. And that's where the justice system failed Rica again. 8 years is a vacation compared to the eternity Rica lost. 8 years is a slap on the wrist for a father who stood by while his child was brutalized. But it was all they could give him, because the system that was supposed to protect Rica never did. Rica wasn't just a victim of Cynthia Baker. She was a victim of a broken system. DCFS had multiple reports of abuse. They investigated. They found nothing. They sent her back. And Rica died. And here's the worst part. Rica is not the only one. 103 children in Illinois died while under DCFS supervision that year. That is a failure on an unimaginable level. That is not a mistake. That is negligence. That is a death sentence for children like Rica, who never had a chance. This is not just another crime story. This is a story about a child who begged for help and was ignored. A child who should still be alive. A child who never got justice. And now, it's up to us to make sure her story is not forgotten. We have to ask the hard questions. Why did DCFS fail? Why was Rica ignored? Why do children like her keep dying? Because the reality is, there are more Ricas out there. Children suffering behind closed doors right now. Children begging for someone to see them. And if we don't talk about it, if we don't demand change, then the next Rica is just waiting to happen. We can't let that happen. If this story shook you, if it made you angry, if it made you want to do something, then let's make sure Rica's name never fades away. Share her story. Talk about it. Demand better. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to this channel. These stories deserve to be told, and we refuse to let them be forgotten. Rest in peace, Rica Rountree. We will never stop saying your name. Thank you all for watching. I will see you in the next one. Bye for now.